The story of the Sherman tank begins long before it rolled across the battlefields of World War II. It starts with a problem and a race against time. In the early 1930s, the U.S. Army had very few tanks. After World War I, most people believed tanks were no longer important. The Great Depression had crushed the economy, and the military received almost no funding. When the world once again began to move toward war, America realized it was unprepared. Europe was already burning. Germany's panzer divisions were fast, deadly, and unstoppable. America needed something that could fight back. In 1940, when France fell to the Nazis, American officers were shocked by how easily the German tanks had crushed the French defenses. They knew the U.S. needed a new medium tank, something powerful, reliable, and fast to produce. And so began the birth of the M4 Sherman. The first design was created in 1941. It had to be simple enough for mass production, yet strong enough to survive on the front lines. The tank used a 75mm main gun, capable of destroying most enemy vehicles at the time, and a .50 caliber machine gun for infantry defense. But the real magic of the Sherman was not in its firepower. It was in its production. Unlike Germany's complex tanks that took weeks or even months to build, a Sherman could be produced quickly and easily. Factories all over the United States worked around the clock. By the end of the war, more than 49,000 Shermans had been built, one of the largest tank productions in history. Each tank was built using parts that could be swapped between models. That meant if a Sherman broke down in the field, mechanics could repair it easily with spare parts. It was the tank version of the assembly line, fast, efficient, and everywhere. That's what made the Sherman not just a machine, but a symbol of American industry. In 1942, the Sherman tank was ready for war. Its first major use came in North Africa, where American and British forces faced the legendary German commander Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The Shermans were not perfect. German panzers often had thicker armor and more powerful guns, but the Americans had one key advantage: numbers. When one Sherman was destroyed, another was right behind it. When a German tank broke down, it took days or weeks to fix, but a damaged Sherman could be repaired or replaced in hours. This relentless supply of tanks slowly turned the tide of war. Soldiers respected the Sherman, but they also feared its weaknesses. Its armor was not thick enough to survive a direct hit from the German Tiger or Panther tanks. Many crews gave it dark nicknames, like Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that lights every time, because when a Sherman was hit in the right spot, it could burst into flames. Still, the crews trusted it. They knew that speed, teamwork, and numbers were their real weapons, and the Sherman gave them the ability to move fast, to fight together, and to keep pushing forward. In 1943, the Sherman became the backbone of the Allied Army. Wherever the Allies went, from Italy to France, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belgium, the Sherman went with them. It was not the strongest or most advanced tank, but it was the one that never stopped. When the D-Day invasion began in June 1944, hundreds of Sherman tanks rolled onto the beaches of Normandy. Some were specially modified to float or to clear mines and obstacles. They gave cover to the infantry and helped secure the beachheads. From there, the Sherman led the way through Europe, city by city, battle by battle. Everywhere the Sherman appeared, it became a symbol of hope for the Allied soldiers. For many, it was their home. They slept in it, ate in it, and fought in it. It carried not only armor and guns, but also courage, fear, and brotherhood. By the end of the war, the Sherman was more than a tank. It was a legend, a machine built by ordinary people, factory workers, engineers, and soldiers, who together created one of the most important weapons of the 20th century. It wasn't perfect, but the Sherman proved that wars are not only won by the biggest guns, they are won by people, and by the power of production, unity, and determination. By the summer of 1943, the M4 Sherman was no longer a new design. It was rolling off assembly lines faster than the Germans could destroy them. But in North Africa and Italy, American crews were beginning to discover something alarming. The German Panzer IV, and especially the Tiger I, could destroy Shermans at ranges where the Americans' 75mm guns could barely scratch their armor. Yet despite this imbalance, the Allies didn't lose faith in the Sherman. Instead of building a super tank, the Americans focused on numbers, reliability, and communication. The Sherman wasn't the toughest, but it could be repaired in the field, shipped across oceans, and built by the tens of thousands. The secret wasn't in the armor. It was in organization and logistics. Every Sherman was part of a greater system: radio-coordinated platoons, mobile maintenance crews, and endless supply convoys. German tankers fought in small, elite units. American tankers fought as one massive, synchronized machine. When D-Day came in June 1944, Shermans landed on the beaches of Normandy. Many were destroyed within minutes, caught in crossfire, or sunk before reaching shore. But for every tank lost, another was waiting offshore. Within days, hundreds of Shermans were rolling through the hedgerows of France. The Germans mocked them as Tommy Cookers, claiming they burned too easily. But soon they learned a harder truth. The Shermans came endlessly, and behind each tank was a radio network connecting artillery, infantry, engineers, and air support. When a German Panther destroyed one Sherman, that Panther's position was radioed instantly, and a squadron of Thunderbolts or Typhoons came screaming down from the sky. The Sherman wasn't fighting alone. It was part of an ecosystem that could adapt, react, and overwhelm. In the chaotic Bocage country, where every field was a trap, Sherman crews learned to work with infantry in ways the Germans rarely did. Tank commanders kept their heads out of the hatches, shouting to soldiers, guiding them through smoke and hedgerows. Many of them were barely 20 years old. In one famous engagement near St. Lo, a Sherman platoon led by Lieutenant James Hill ran into an ambush of hidden Panthers. The first two tanks were destroyed instantly. Instead of retreating, Hill ordered his remaining tanks to flank through a side road while calling artillery through his radio. Within minutes, shells began raining on the German line, allowing the infantry to advance. Hill's calm coordination saved dozens of men, and the battle became a textbook example of radio-driven tactics. By late 1944, new Sherman variants were arriving. The M4A3 with a stronger 76mm gun, better suspension, and improved armor. Crews began to feel they could finally fight back on more equal terms. But what truly changed the war wasn't a new gun. It was the speed of command. German officers often had to wait for orders relayed through long chains of command. American units, each with their own radios, could react in seconds. As one captured German tanker later said, "It was not that their tanks were better, it was that they were everywhere, and they always knew where we were." The Sherman became a rolling symbol of that American approach: simple, coordinated, unstoppable. Every day, more poured in from factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. They came in olive drab, dusty, battle-worn, but always moving forward. Mechanics called them metal mules, because no matter how broken they looked, they just kept going. When the winter of 1944 arrived, the Battle of the Bulge became the Sherman's harshest trial. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German Tiger IIs waited like silent predators. American crews often had to outsmart them, ambushing from behind, calling in airstrikes, or targeting tracks to immobilize the beasts. In one battle near Bastogne, a single Sherman named Cobra King made history by leading the relief column that broke through to the surrounded 101st Airborne. It wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but it was there when it mattered. The men inside those tanks didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were cold, tired, and scared, but they trusted their machines and the invisible voices crackling through their radios. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was a bridge between thousands of soldiers moving toward one goal: ending the war. As 1945 began, the Sherman had become a familiar sight across Europe. From the snowy forests of Belgium to the ruins of French villages, its tracks carved a trail of progress. Every crew had its own way of personalizing the tank. Names painted on the side, lucky charms tied to antennas, or pin-up girls drawn on the armor. To the men who fought inside, the Sherman wasn't just steel, it was home. Each morning, tankers awoke inside frozen hulls, wiping condensation from periscopes, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. They were exhausted but focused. The mission was clear: cross the Rhine, enter Germany, and end the war. The Germans were fighting desperately. The once mighty Wehrmacht was fractured, running on fumes. Yet even in its final months, it could be deadly. Hidden 88mm guns, lurking Panthers, and the infamous Tiger II tanks turned every road into a potential ambush. Sherman crews knew that one wrong move could end it all, but they also knew something else. They weren't alone. Overhead flew swarms of Allied aircraft, and on the ground, convoys stretched for miles. Behind every tank was the power of an entire nation's industry. In February 1945, near the town of Remagen, the Shermans reached the banks of the Rhine River. Germany's last natural defense, the Ludendorff Bridge, one of the few still standing, became the key. When U.S. forces captured it, intact engineers raced to secure it, and Sherman tanks began rolling across under enemy fire. The crossing of the Rhine marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. Beyond the river, the landscape changed. Town after town lay in ruins, bridges destroyed, roads cratered. Civilians emerged from basements, dazed and silent. For many Sherman crews, this was their first direct glimpse of Germany, not as an enemy fortress, but as a wounded nation collapsing under the weight of its own war. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a tank commander from the 3rd Armored Division, later wrote, "We didn't feel like conquerors. We felt like men who had seen too much death. Every burned village, every broken tank, it was all proof that war had no winners." Yet the battles continued. Near Cologne, one of the most iconic duels of the war took place. A single German Panther lay hidden in the city streets, waiting. As an American Sherman turned the corner, the Panther fired first, destroying it instantly. But another Sherman spotted the flash, maneuvered through the rubble, and returned fire. 3 shots later, the Panther was burning. The moment was caught on film by a combat cameraman and became one of the most famous tank fights in history, a perfect image of the Sherman's courage and persistence. By March, the Allied armies were advancing faster than anyone expected. The Shermans led the way through the Ruhr Valley, past abandoned Luftwaffe airfields, over shattered bridges. German resistance crumbled, but every mile still cost lives. Mines, hidden Panzerfausts, and snipers turned even small towns into death traps. Mechanics worked without rest. Tracks snapped, engines overheated, guns jammed. But the Shermans kept rolling. Soldiers began calling them the Iron Friends. In one division, the maintenance crews managed to keep 90% of their tanks operational, even after months of nonstop fighting, a feat unmatched by any other army. The deeper they went into Germany, the more surreal it became. Some towns surrendered without a fight, others resisted until the last man. Civilians hung white sheets from windows as the Shermans approached, praying the shells would not come. Then in April 1945, the crews began encountering something they could hardly comprehend: the concentration camps. The first Sherman to reach the gates of Ohrdruf stopped before a sight its crew would never forget. Emaciated prisoners, piles of bodies, and the stench of death filled the air. These tankers, hardened by 2 years of battle, broke down in silence. They called for medics, food, and help, but there was no real way to help. For many, this was the moment they truly understood what they had been fighting for. The final push came quickly after that. Across the Elbe River, Shermans met Soviet T-34s rolling in from the east. The two armies, once strangers, now saluted each other amid the wreckage of Germany. The war in Europe was almost over, but even then, not all fighting had stopped. In isolated pockets, SS troops still resisted. Villages were turned into strongholds, forcing Sherman crews to go house by house. Commanders ordered caution, but adrenaline and fear drove many forward anyway. They wanted to end it, now. By early May, word spread through the ranks. Hitler was dead. Crews stared in disbelief. Some cheered, some cried. Others just sat quietly inside their tanks, engines idling. They had survived when so many had not. In the following days, the guns fell silent. Shermans parked along roadsides, their barrels still warm, their tracks coated in mud and ash. The war was over, but for the men inside them, the memories would never fade. They had lived and fought inside a machine that was more than just steel. It was the embodiment of determination, of mass production turned into victory. When American journalists asked German prisoners what they feared most about the Allies, the answers surprised them. It wasn't the bombers or the artillery, it was the logistics, the never-ending flow of tanks, fuel, food, and ammunition that seemed impossible to stop. A captured German officer admitted, "You Americans could afford to lose 10 tanks for every one of ours." But somehow, by the end, it was always our tanks that were burning. The Sherman became the face of that unstoppable wave. Even when outgunned, it outlasted. Even when ambushed, it adapted. And even when destroyed, there was always another one taking its place. After the surrender, thousands of Shermans lined up in fields, silent and rusting under the European rain. Some would be scrapped, others shipped to new allies, fighting again in Korea or the Middle East. But each carried the legacy of a war that reshaped the world. For the soldiers who served in them, the Sherman would forever symbolize a simple truth: that victory doesn't always belong to the strongest, but to those who endure, who communicate, and who never stop moving forward. When the war ended, the roar of the Sherman's engine slowly faded into history. The world it helped create was no longer the same. Cities rebuilt, nations rose, and soldiers returned home, trying to remember what peace felt like. For many of those men, the sound of treads on gravel or the crackle of a radio would stay with them forever. They had lived through something larger than themselves, not just a battle of nations, but a struggle of ideas, of endurance, and of humanity. The Sherman was never perfect. It burned easily. Its gun often couldn't pierce German armor head-on. And yet it was good enough, because it was there, always. That was its greatest strength, availability. When the call came, the Sherman answered. When one fell, another took its place. And when the world needed hope, that olive-drab silhouette appeared on the horizon. Even decades later, veterans would look back on those machines not as weapons, but as companions. They gave them names, painted them, talked to them as if they were alive. "She'll get us home," they used to say. In a sense, she did. The Sherman didn't just win battles, it connected men across continents through the radios that whispered orders and fears, through the teamwork that turned chaos into precision. It proved that war wasn't only about who had the biggest guns, but who could communicate, organize, and endure. In museums today, restored Shermans sit silent under bright lights. Children climb onto their hulls, unaware of the stories they carry. The young crewmen who never came back. the battles fought in frozen forests, the hope carried across oceans. Every scratch on that steel tells a story. Every dent, a memory. The German pilots once laughed at the Thunderbolt. The German generals once mocked American logistics. And the German tankers once called the Sherman a joke. But in the end, it was those very machines, built not for glory but for reliability, that rolled into victory. When you stand beside one now, cold and still, you can almost hear the echoes. The rumble of engines, the shouts over the radio, the heartbeat of a world fighting for its future. And somewhere in that echo is the lesson the Sherman left behind. That courage isn't found in armor or guns, but in the people who keep moving forward, no matter what stands in their way.